This is NIU's Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Language and Literacy, or CISLL's Fall Kickoff. So this is our first big in-person event for the year, and we are so thrilled to have you all join us. So I'd like to just quickly introduce our team. My name is Allison Gladfelter. I'm one of the speech-language pathology faculty here at NIU, and I'm thrilled to get to serve in this role alongside my co-director, Lindsay Harris. Yes, so Lindsay is in the Ed Psych department, and then Julia Ogg. We have 3 deputy directors that each represent the 3 different special interest groups of CISLL. Mandy is sick, unfortunately, so she's not here today. We also have Melissa Klukas-Walter. Hello. And then we wouldn't be able to do anything without our graduate assistant, Emma. And we also have an administrative assistant, Nicole Giardelli. These are sort of the 3 main areas that CISLL represents. So, Julie, I don't know if you want to share.
So my area is diversity and language processing, and that's a pretty broad topic. We focus on reading and language disabilities. We also have a lot of work in the social relationship area. One of our first events later this semester will be the first show and share, and we actually have our first speaker in the SIG one, which is Dr. Christine Malecki. She's going to talk about some work she's doing in the social relationship building area, thinking about the social relationship of labeling and discrimination in terms of disability is another focus of the SIG one. So please reach out if you have any ideas for talks. We do 2 per year with the show and shares.
Great, thank you. Okay, and I'll go ahead and speak for Mandy because she's not here today. So Mandy leads our second language learning and bilingualism SIG. So as you can see, this focuses on national and international perspectives, the unique advantages and disadvantages facing speakers or learners of more than one language. So if you have any ideas of really great topics, please email those to Mandy, and then I'll invite Melissa to speak about our third SIG.
Hi everyone, I'm Melissa Walter, and I am the Deputy Director of SIG 3, which is learning within the disciplines as well as across the lifespan. So we focus a lot on teaching and learning. We focus on things like motivation in school climates, social emotional factors, a little bit of the relationship building, so we have a little bit of overlap with SIG 1. But just like everyone else said, if you have any ideas or would like to volunteer to present at one of our show and shares, we'd love to have you.
These are some of our upcoming events for this semester, and we have handy little postcard placards that you can put in front of your computer so you always remember to come. One of the offerings that we have is a writing retreat. I think all of us push writing to the back burner. Yes, I see lots of nods. You've got teaching commitments or something else that's coming up, and it's easy to put your writing off to the side. So this is a way, I always joke that this is like our Weight Watchers weekly weigh-in. Like, you show up, you say, this is what I think I'm going to write, and then we quietly write for an hour, and then at the end it's like, did you do it or not? And it's virtual, so I know we have a lot of commuters, so this is hopefully something, students are encouraged to come to, especially if you're trying to make sure you're hitting your thesis or capstone or dissertation targets. It's a great excuse and a supportive group to get your writing done. As was mentioned, we also have our first show and share event. So these are sort of 3 lightning talks from researchers that represent each of the different SIGs. And they will be on Wednesday, November 1st from 2 to 3:15, and we'll have, again, cookies and coffee. Something else I'd like to just make sure you have on your radar, CISLL does like to offer funding support for especially interdisciplinary projects focused on language and literacy. We are offering a faculty-level grant as well as student-level grants. The faculty proposals, depending on what we receive, we can fund up to $11,000. So if that's 5,500 proposals or 3,000 or whatever we get. But if you're interested in that, the due date is Monday. So please consider spending your weekend writing a POP grant. We also offer 2 student ones. So if you have a thesis or dissertation student who needs some funding to get some pilot data or some other project launched, we are happy to fund 2 $2,000 student grants as well. And again, priority given to anything obviously related to language and literacy, and interdisciplinary projects are especially encouraged. Trying to amplify our CISLL affiliates research reach through submitting your projects to Husky Commons, which is NIU's open access repository. So if you would like help getting your research out there in an open access way, you can just submit your PDFs of your accepted manuscripts to our email, CISLL@niu.edu, and we'll work with the NIU library to get your research out there. We also have a lot of equipment and technology that we're happy to lend out to CISLL affiliates. We're most excited about our eye tracker. So if you have any interest in doing any eye tracking type of research, it's free and available. If you're like, I want to learn how to do this, but I don't know how to get started, go to our website. We have a bunch of training videos. We have the manual for the equipment. We're happy to give you a tour. You can come tinker and play, but feel free to please reach out if you're at all interested in using our eye tracker.
I'm Lindsay Harris. We would like to encourage you, if you are ever in the position where you're applying for external funding from outside of NIU, you have the option to list affiliate centers as part of your grant submission. It's just this one little window in InfoEd where you have to indicate your department, your college, and then if you have an IDU or a center. Now, what does it mean that CISLL is an affiliate center? For many years I was a CISLL member, and I labored under the misapprehension that for CISLL to be an affiliate center, CISLL needed to be somehow doing the research with me, or else had somehow like directly funded my pilot data that led to the research, which we can do with our POP grants that we talked about, and we often do, but that's not the only way that CISLL is an affiliate center on your grant. If you value CISLL and have benefited from our listserv or from our events or from our writing retreats or just from feeling special because you have a placard on your door, we'd like to think that we have somehow been involved in the proposal that's led to your grant. And what happens if you include us as an affiliate center is instead of 55% of your facilities and administrative costs on your grant going to research and innovation partnerships, instead 40% goes to them and 15% goes to us, which means that we can buy eye trackers and we can bring cool people like Dr. Krizman to campus and do other things for our affiliates. Offer POP grants, keep the virtuous cycle flowing. So yeah, just keep that in mind when you're applying for grants. And if you need help in the grant preparation process, let us know and we will find out how to help you. It's time for our special guest, whom Melissa is going to introduce.
It is my honor to introduce our guest speaker today. Dr. Jennifer Krizman is a research associate professor at Northwestern University. She studies how biology and experience influence the auditory, cognitive, and linguistic processors listeners engage in to understand speech in everyday settings. To study this, she uses the frequency following response, an objective electrophysiological measure of auditory processing, together with behavioral assessments of executive, language, and listening abilities. Her work focuses on how language experience, such as the number of languages a person speaks, influences speech understanding. The aim of her research is to improve human communication, and she is here today to talk with us about how the languages we speak impact how we listen.
We're going to be talking about, first of all, why study sound to study bilingualism. And I'll talk about one particular measure that we use called the FFR, or frequency following response. So why would we use that and what it is? And then I'll start going into how the languages we speak shape our auditory processing, focusing particularly on processing using the FFR. And then I'm going to talk about bilingualism and executive functions. So this is tying in some of the existing literature on findings that bilinguals have some enhanced executive functions relative to monolinguals. I want to really bring that all home with the idea of how does this all fit in with speech and noise recognition. And then I want to end that section with talking about the benefits of bilingualism. And hopefully, time permitting, I really want to talk about some of my new work that switches gears and instead of looking at bilingual as the listener, looking at bilinguals as the speaker and how it is that we understand accented speech. Why study sound? I love studying sound because making sense of sound is one of the hardest things that we ask of our brain. And we have these connections that are ascending that are going to send that signal to the brain, but we also have even more descending connections that are going to connect our executive or visual or somatosensory with our auditory system to really help to be able to pick out a part of sound that's going to be most beneficial to us based off of our experience with sound in the past. And so I think the takeaway is, our experience with sound influences how we hear in the moment. And I think this is a really good example. So I'm going to start off by playing this sound. Could anybody hear what that sentence was? Do you believe me that there was even a sentence in there? Okay, I'll play the regular version.
The juice of lemons makes fine punch.
All right, we all understood that, right? The juice of lemons makes fine punch. Now listen to the degraded version again.
The juice of lemons makes fine punch.
Do you hear it now? Isn't that crazy? Right? So it's how we engage with sound that matters. And I know this is just a short-term example, but what I'm going to be talking about today is really more of that long-term example of the languages that we speak and how that kind of slowly sculpts our brain over time to shape it in a way that is helpful for us. So now the way that I look at this is I measure the frequency following response, or FFR. So what we do is we place 3 electrodes on the participant, one on the forehead, one on the ear, and one on the top of the head. And the top of the head is where we're getting that electrical information from that we're going to be looking at for the FFR. So we play a sound wave to the participant's ear, and what we're recording is something that's microvolts and nanovolts in size. It's very tiny. So what we do is we'll play that a couple thousand times to the participant. It's a very short stimulus. It's kind of like da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So it happens pretty quickly, but we're able to then get this ongoing continuous EEG that we will then filter to bias it towards the subcortical contribution, which is where our frequency following response is mostly coming from. And when we put it all together, we end up with this brain wave that you can see looks a lot like the sound wave that evoked it. So there's really a great deal of similarity. It's so similar, in fact, that we can actually play it back and it sounds like that sound wave too. Here's just a musical scale. So you can actually hear it in the sound itself. So now what we do is we can also study this across the lifespan. We look from the youngest one, the person that we've tested is 3 months old, all the way up through 90 years old. We can use the same exact brain measure and the exact same protocol on all of them. And we've studied different sources of enrichment and deprivation, and I'm really going to be focusing mostly on the bilingualism piece for today. So now one of the nice things about the fact that the sound wave and the brain wave look so similar is that we can extract those sound features from the brain wave itself. So we can look at distinct components of the signal and see how well the brain is responding to them. So we can isolate effects to the fundamental frequency, which is going to be what's conveying the pitch information, from the amplitude, which is just telling us how loud the sound is, from the harmonics, which are going to give us information about what separates a ba from a ga, timing, which is just the landmark peaks in the response, and timing is something that's important for looking at things like neural delays. Consistency, so remember how I said that we present the response a couple thousand times, or the stimulus a couple thousand times, so we can look at from one trial to the next, how consistent is it. And then the last thing we can look at is neural noise. In between each stimulus presentation, there's this silent gap and all of that neural activity that's happening there is just kind of random noise fluctuations in the brain. And so we can look at that as well. And what we've seen is that there's different effects on these different components for different sources of enrichment, where some might increase and others might decrease, and for different types of deprivation, where some might decrease and others might increase. And I'll talk about some of those specifics today. The other thing that I want to show is that even though it really represents the stimulus nicely, individuals have their own unique neural response. And what I'll show is that it's really shaped by their years of experience. So we have a study going on with all of our student athletes at Northwestern, and we're testing them once every 6 months. It's a concussion study and a subconcussion study. So we want to look at their any brain changes from playing in contact or collision sports. But what you can see is that if we record responses to these two individuals at age 18, they have responses that are very different from one another. But their responses from 18 to 18 and a half are conserved, 19, 19 and a half, and 20. Kind of to put this another way, if we look at the responses layered over time, we can see that each has a very, very replicable response, that it's their own response, it's their own identity. So now that I've told you about the FFR and played you kind of some examples, now I want to talk about how does language shape the brain and how do we look at this using the FFR. So our hypothesis is really that bilingualism is a form of enrichment and that it's going to induce plasticity in both auditory and executive systems that's going to be important for real-world communication. So we think that bilingualism is something that happens in the real world, so you're training your brain in the real world, and therefore anything that is going to be beneficial is going to extend into the real world. So today, what I'll be showing you is whether or not these enhancements exist and describing them. Spoiler alert, they exist. Determine whether or not I can show if these enhancements are in fact driven by language experience. Kind of that chicken and the egg argument. Is it the case that people who are bilingual, because they have some type of predisposition to being really good at languages, or is it the case that bilinguals, the experience of being a bilingual can lead to these enhancements? And then I want to talk about how this works for real-world listening. The beginning of this actually didn't start in our lab with my work. It actually started with a colleague of ours, Ravi Krishnan, over at Purdue. And what he did is he studied young adults, monolingual English speakers, and Chinese Mandarin English bilingual speakers. And he recorded their FFRs to Mandarin tones. So we know that tones are lexically meaningful, that they will distinguish words. And so pitch trajectory has a very specific meaning for communication for a Mandarin speaker that it doesn't have in English. There's a flat, a rising, a dipping, and a falling. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the response to that rising tone between the English monolinguals and the Mandarin English bilinguals. And I just want to say, while they're doing this, there's no task. They're sleeping. So they're fast asleep. They're not having to do any type of response. And we're looking at whether or not their brains just passively respond to these sounds differently. And so what we looked at is if they focused in on this region where there's this fast changing pitch trajectory, and we can see here's the English speakers average in blue, and you can see that there's a lot of deviation from the pitch trajectory in black. But if we look at the Chinese Mandarin speakers, we can see that they're really hugging that pitch trajectory very nicely. So even if you're fast asleep, if you are a Mandarin English bilingual, you are going to have a better representation of those sounds in your language than someone who is an English monolingual and does not have familiarity with those sounds. So this led me to ask, well, can we extend this to non-tonal languages? Is it something that is specific to just being a tonal language speaker and those sounds and those pitch trajectories being familiar to your language? Or is it the case that you're bilingual? And so for this study, I was working with 14-year-old adolescents from the city of Chicago, and I had monolinguals who were monolingual from birth, no exposure to any other languages, The proficiency and exposure ratings come from Dr. Viorica-Marion's LEAP-Q, which is a language experience and proficiency questionnaire. So these are self-reports combined with their parents' reports. So I had both parents and children fill out these reports, so we're looking at the average exposure and proficiency. And so you can see that the bilingual children reported spending about 60% of their day in English and had a high proficiency of both English and Spanish, but were a little bit more dominant in English than Spanish. And they were all early exposed, so these were all simultaneous or early acquiring bilinguals by the age of 5. What I did is I recorded the frequency following response to that syllable da that we use quite a lot. And I was interested in looking at the amplitude of the response. And I also focused on the fundamental frequency of the response because this is a level tone right here, but it's just another way of looking at the pitch, kind of like how Dr. Krizman looked at the pitch trajectory in the previous study. So in doing this, I have got bilinguals plotted in red, monolinguals plotted in black, and you can see that the bilinguals have a larger response overall compared to the monolinguals in black. So now if I flip this into the frequency domain via fast Fourier transform, now I'm looking at the fundamental frequency and the harmonics here, and you can see that the bilinguals in red have a much larger encoding of the fundamental frequency than the monolinguals do in black. And what's interesting is that I recorded these responses to da in both quiet and in 6-talk or babble, and there's no drop-off in response for our bilingual talkers. So normally when you play the sound and noise, we see a much smaller response. But that only happened for our monolinguals, not our bilinguals. The other factor that we wanted to look at is this measure of response consistency. So that's where we have all of our stimuli, and we can look at an average of the first half and an average of the second half, and we can just correlate those two together. And a very consistent response is going to align better between the two halves. A less consistent response has a lot more variability between the two halves. And so with calculating this correlation between waveforms for monolinguals and bilinguals, we see that bilinguals have more consistent responses. One of the things that I want to say is that we've done this in children with dyslexia, and we found that children with dyslexia are on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, that they have very inconsistent responses, which makes a lot of sense when you think about children who are dyslexic will struggle with things like phonological awareness and being able to manipulate the phonemes of a language. And we think it's because they're not getting that stable representation in their brains of those different phonemes, and that there's a lot of crossover for them because of that instability. Whereas having this exposure to multiple languages really helps to tune that stability, because if you think about it, you now have phonemes that span different languages. Some of them may overlap between the two languages, whereas some of them may be more distinct, and so it really behooves you to be able to have good phonological representation, to really have that stable representation in your brain. There's a tie of response consistency, and your response consistency is really tied to your language skills throughout the spectrum. And the other thing that we see is that in our bilingual kids, that the extent of their response consistency correlates with their language proficiency. So the more proficient they are across both of their languages, so the more balanced, high proficiency bilingual you are, the higher your response consistency. We didn't see this same pattern for the monolinguals, in part because they just have high rankings of proficiency in general. And also because there's a lot of other factors that are probably training their phonological awareness for these folks. So we've got some evidence with the correlation that we can attribute these biological enhancements in auditory processing to language experience, to bilingualism. But the real test of that would be to actually look at kids who differ in their second language experience. So to do that, this was a project that we did with kids out in Los Angeles, and we grouped them into simultaneous bilinguals, so those who learned both English and Spanish from birth, and sequential bilinguals, so bilinguals who began acquiring around preschool year. We can see that they're relatively well matched for daily exposure to English and Spanish, although for both it's a little bit more Spanish dominant. Remember that these kids are about half the age of my adolescents, and it's very common to see that the older you get, the more time you spend in whatever the environmental language is, which was in this case English. So I wouldn't be surprised if I were to check in with these kids now, they would look more like my adolescents, where it's a much higher percentage of the day spent in English. The first thing we looked at is we looked at their brain response to this DA again, and we find that for the simultaneous, so now simultaneous is in red and sequential is in black, and we can see that the simultaneous bilinguals have a larger response to this stimulus. And we can see that it's really concentrated in this encoding of the fundamental frequency. So this pitch cue is being enhanced in our simultaneous bilinguals. This enhancement is really just driven by this enhancement of the pitch. So they have a much larger representation of the pitch. And that representation of the pitch grows with your amount of bilingual experience. So the longer you're bilingual, the more your pitch grows. And I'll talk about why I think that is. That's coming up. Because there's a couple of different pieces that I need to put into the story before I get into the, well, why does this all matter? But I promise you I will get there. So the exact same thing is true with response consistency. So the more you are bilingual, the more consistent your brain response is. Why bilinguals would have better pitch encoding? Why does it matter? So to answer this question, I looked back to some of the existing literature on bilingualism. And so Dr. Kroll's group has shown that, bilinguals always have both of their languages active, and they have to actively suppress one language while communicating in the language of their target language. And so they've been thought of as being mental jugglers of two languages, making these sound-to-meaning connections, whereas a monolingual will only have one term to match to an object, cat. If you're a Spanish-English bilingual, well, now you have these two terms to match to an object. And so you have almost double the vocabulary, the language in your brain, and you're having to turn some on and off at different times. And so, and this was actually a really cool study that Dr. Virika Marian, who's in my department, did during her postdoctoral work, showing that the two languages are always active. So it was this task that was done completely in English, and it was English-Russian bilinguals. They never once was Russian spoken. And it was an eye-tracking task. And so what they were asked to do was to look at the match. And so their eyes would go to the match. But sometimes they were asked, look at the stamp. And they would go to the stamp, but their eyes would also go to the marker. Does anybody know what the Russian word for stamp is? Yes. Exactly. So there's the overlap, not within the English language, but across the two languages. Even though all they heard was stamp, their brain was also hearing marca. And so they made looks to the marker as well. That idea that there's this co-activation happening, that one language is always having to be suppressed while the other language is being engaged, has led to this idea that bilinguals will have boosted inhibitory control. So inhibitory control is this executive function that allows you to really focus on a target object and ignore irrelevant objects. And so for bilinguals, they're constantly having to focus on the target language and ignore the irrelevant language. And so a lot of people have done this with like a dimensional change card sorting task. And this is something that we did with our kids. So you have a square and a triangle, and the squares and triangles are either yellow or green. And you go through the first time, and you have to sort by shape. So whenever you see it, you sort by shape. And then when you go it through the second time, now you have to sort by color. And what we do for our kids, because they're older, this is what you do if it's like a younger kid, like kindergarten or something, but for our older kids, we interleave whether or not they're supposed to sort by color or by shape, so it's a difficult task. Requires some thinking. And so what we find is that our bilingual kids do this better. So they do it faster and they make fewer mistakes. And it's this inhibitory control, so this ability to really focus on the relevant and ignore the irrelevant, that relates with your FFR, your auditory brain's response consistency. And so I think those two things kind of work together. It makes a little bit of sense, right? That if you have a consistent response, that means you're responding to the same important features from one trial to the next, and you're not responding to those irrelevant features. You're not letting the noise in. And so to me, it makes a lot of sense then that you would see this behavior to brain connection. And we also see this exact same relationship with FO encoding, the pitch encoding. So these things are all working in tandem. Better pitch encoding, the better response consistency, the better inhibitory control. We didn't see this relationship in monolinguals. And now the question is kind of why. All of this got me thinking about speech and noise. So every day we have to listen to sounds and noise. It's very rare that we're able to communicate in a quiet, pristine environment. And we've done a lot of work on speech and noise in our lab, and we know that there's two things that are really, really important for somebody to be good at understanding speech and noise. One of them is having good pitch encoding. So pitch is what's going to allow you to lock on to that target talker amid all of that distracting information. So it's what's going to distinguish my voice from Melissa's voice. And so that's what's going to allow you to say, okay, now it's time to pay attention to Jen while she's talking and ignore everybody else. And we also see that having good inhibitory control is going to be relating with better speech and noise. So if you are able to focus on that, maintain that focus on that target talker and not be influenced by all of that irrelevant information happening on the sides, you're going to be better at speech and noise. So you would think, based off of these two measures, that bilinguals should be better at speech and noise. But we know from quite a few years of literature that they're not. We see that native monolinguals will do the best, and that the earlier you learn your second language, the better you're going to do in speech and noise, but that you're still going to struggle relative to a native monolingual. So we wanted to try and investigate this a little bit more and see, well, why is there this known difficulty or difference for listening to speech and noise, yet they have all of the executive and auditory mechanisms that say bilingual should be great at this. So this was a study that we did again with our adolescents, and they're roughly about the same group as last time. We have a few different people in there. But what we're looking at is we're looking at how they're doing on multiple different speech and noise, or listening and noise tasks. So what we did is we had them listen to sentences in noise. The young boy left home, embedded in noise. Then we had them listen to words in noise. Say the word dog, repeat back dog. And then we had them listen to tones in noise. And so on all these tasks, they had to repeat back the word or the sound, the sentence that they heard, or push a button when they heard the tone. The reason why we're doing this is because we think that there's a big language factor, and that it's the language component that is making it that children who are bilingual are doing worse on a speech and noise test than a monolingual. And that the executive and auditory are actually what they're really using to try and do this test. So we wanted to remove the linguistic load. We wanted to vary that linguistic load across these tests. And so what we find is, again, we've got monolinguals in black, bilinguals in red, and you can see that our bilinguals are doing worse on the sentences and noise test, just like we would expect based off of years and years of literature. They're starting to get closer to performing similar to our monolinguals when it's just words. When it's tones, it flips. Now the bilinguals are outperforming our monolinguals on detecting tones and noise. So this suggests that bilinguals and monolinguals are using two different strategies to understand speech in noisy settings. So if you roughly think of them as those language-dependent measures and those language-independent measures, then we have our language-dependent measures of context and vocabulary size, where you can fill in the blanks and make a pretty good guess of what somebody said, even if you didn't hear all the words. And that's what our monolinguals are using. Whereas for our language-independent measures, well, we have that pitch encoding and that response consistency and that inhibitory control. And that's what our bilinguals are using to understand speech and noise. So there's this trade-off that's happening in the mechanisms that are dominating to understand speech and noise. To look at this a little bit further, this was a study that we did in 18-year-olds, late adolescent, early young adults, Spanish-English bilinguals. Again, you can see that high proficiency in both Spanish and English. These are still simultaneous or early acquiring bilinguals, and they still have that about 60-30 split for English to Spanish daily exposure. And so what we did for this test is it's the coordinate response measure corpus. And so it has sentences like ready, and then there's a call sign, go to, and then a color number, and now. So we wanted to constrict the set of possible words to try and equate performance for the bilinguals and monolinguals. So we could try and level this playing field a little bit because we were interested in looking at mechanisms. We had this as two competing talkers. So you would pay attention to one talker and ignore the other talker. So our two our call signs were tiger and baron, one female, one male, and either the male or female would say baron or tiger. So you didn't know which sex was going to say your call sign, but as soon as you heard your call sign, you had to follow it to that color number combination. And so then you would respond. They had a little game console that they would push the button that corresponded.
Ready, baron, go to green 8 now.
Did you hear it? It takes a lot of attention to do this task. So what we did is we looked at their performance on the speech and noise task, and even though there's a slight decrease for our bilinguals, they actually performed the same. So having a closed list, we were able to get matched performance. And for our inhibitory control measure, so now this time, while we have a little bit of an edge for the bilinguals, we don't see that inhibitory control advantage. So this is more consistent now with the other researchers who've said there isn't this inhibitory advantage. It's not a big deal. I've got a slide to explain why I think that is in a second. But what I think is very cool is that only for the bilinguals did we see a correlation between their inhibitory control and their speech and noise, whereas we didn't see it for the monolinguals. We saw this relationship for the bilinguals as well for the pitch encoding. So having a stronger pitch was something that we saw at age 14 that was also maintained in our 18-year-olds and also correlated with performance on that speech and noise test just for our bilinguals. So I think that this lends some evidence to the fact that what we're seeing is that bilinguals call upon their inhibitory control abilities and their auditory processing, so that stronger pitch encoding and that stronger response consistency to be able to follow the target talker to try and be able to understand speech and noise, because they don't have as much context to rely on, because bilinguals spend 30, 40, 50% less time in that language than monolinguals do, and so they just have less of the awareness of the statistical probabilities of that language. So they have to rely on domain general processes. What do I think is happening, and why is it the case that we didn't always see that inhibitory control was stronger in bilinguals? I think that what happens is that there's an advantage that happens in early childhood and early adolescence because there's just a greater exposure to a more diverse, rich language set. And you're constantly learning from a very young age to turn some on, turn some off, and to juggle those two languages in your brain. There's a lot of other things that will boost inhibitory control and train inhibitory control so that by the time that you get to young adulthood, the monolinguals and bilinguals are much more likely to be equated, but that we see that they actually will reemerge at the other end of the lifespan. Whereas I think what we're showing here is that those auditory processing enhancements, they persist throughout. It's something specific to being a bilingual and being able to hang on to that extra pitch information that's going to last throughout the lifespan for bilinguals. So just kind of an interim summary, we see that bilingualism boosts auditory processing with stronger pitch encoding and more consistent responses, and that it also boosts inhibitory control, and that this acts as a compensatory mechanism for not having all of the same linguistic knowledge as a monolingual to be able to understand speech and noise. Kind of switch gears and talk about some other different advantages of being bilingual. And so one of the things that we've looked at is socioeconomic status. And we've just defined this kind of grossly and, with just looking at maternal and paternal education level. And what we've seen is for individuals who come from low SES homes, using this definition, that they have less consistent responses. And they also have noisier responses. And the way we've been thinking about that is that it's just kind of like static in the radio. So we know that children who are very young, they also have inconsistent and noisy brain responses. And it's because their brains are just starting out. They're just learning to engage with the world. They're just hearing about language and meaningful sounds. And as they get older, by the time they reach school age, there's a very stark decrease in neural noise and increase in response consistency that continues throughout the school age years into adulthood. And so what we think is that we know from, for example, the Hart and Risley study from 1995, that there is a difference in the number and quality of words that are spoken in low versus high SES homes. And I'm really generalizing here. I don't want to make any hard and fast rules about this because it's certainly exceptions. But nevertheless, we did find that low maternal education, less consistent brains. But remember, like I said, bilinguals have more consistent responses. So what we did is we wanted to look at whether or not bilingualism can offset some of the effects of socioeconomic impoverishment. And the reason why I really wanted to look at this is just because a lot of kids who are coming from a low SES home and coming from a bilingual family, it can be seen as a stigma if you're not able to speak English at the same grade level as your peers when you first come into school. But, I think that we should be thinking about this as being something that's advantageous for the bilingual as opposed to disadvantageous. That it's going to give them something better in the long run, even if they're a little bit behind in the beginning. So what we did is we looked at monolinguals and bilinguals and divided them into two groups, a low SES group and a high SES group. And comparing just the monolinguals, we see exactly what I was just saying, that low SES monolinguals have lower response consistency than high SES monolinguals. Not surprisingly, the same is true if we compare high SES bilinguals to low SES monolinguals. But the real question is what happens if we look at low SES bilinguals? And we see that they have really consistent responses. So that diverse auditory experience of being a bilingual and learning two languages is going to lead to these improvements in response consistency. It's going to lead to more consistent responses in the brain. And we saw similar enhancements in our inhibitory control measure and also for phonological awareness. So remember how I said that if you have a less stable response, you have poorer phonological awareness. So it makes sense that these things are going to be linked together. Remember how I said that a lot of those advantages of being bilingual come back at the other end of the lifespan? Well, there's tons of evidence right now that show that bilingualism can stave off Alzheimer's disease. So if you look at the age where symptoms first start becoming reported, it's much younger for monolinguals than it is for bilinguals, so early 70s versus mid to late 70s. The age of diagnosis differs. So what this is saying is that the level of atrophy that happens in the brain. It takes more atrophy to match the same level of symptoms. So bilinguals will be actually further along in the progression of Alzheimer's before it starts to affect their daily life. They do a brain scan at the same time that they assess their symptoms, and so the symptoms that they are reporting or that they're experiencing are at the level of 20% impairment for a monolingual, but they're 50% impairment for a bilingual. It's kind of tricky to think about, but it's just the idea that if you match them on symptoms, the brain of the bilingual patient looks worse. It takes more atrophy, more damage to get to that symptom level. Next, I want to try to switch gears and talk about monolingual listeners, really focus on them, and talk about what happens as we age. Focusing more on not the bilingual as the listener, but the bilingual as the speaker. So how do we understand accented speakers? Is this similar to what we know about speech and noise? And of course, then how does hearing loss fit in? Part of it is that I think middle age groups are completely understudied, but also as I moved into middle age, I was like, this is my age group, and it's understudied. We need to get to know this group a little bit better. And also hearing loss. I feel like I'm also not hearing as sharply as I was back in my young adult days, so I felt like, we need to also understand hearing loss in middle age too. When I talk about speech and noise, I think the easiest way to think about it and how this might relate to accented speech is to use a Where's-Waldo comparison. Every day we have to listen to speech and noise, and I think we often just take that for granted, especially in our younger years. Once we get older, we completely understand that noise is ubiquitous and we have to constantly deal with it. We've trained our ears, we've trained our brains for a number of years that we've gotten pretty good at pretty quickly finding Waldo. Speech and noise for a long time isn't a problem. For accented speech, it can be a little bit more challenging because of the fact that, you've spent your entire life learning that Waldo wears a white and red shirt. But now you have to learn that Waldo is actually wearing a cream and beige shirt. And so having to remap your picture, your internal store of Waldo can be a challenge. But now imagine having to do that with hearing loss. It's kind of the same as make the photo a little bit fuzzy. Our hearing becomes a little bit fuzzy. And so now try understanding speech and noise and accents in noise with hearing loss. For this study, my hypothesis is that different auditory processing mechanisms are engaged depending on the type of speech distortion and the level of hearing acuity. So I think that what we're going to see is that we're going to have different auditory mechanisms for speech and noise as compared to accented speech, and that how we engage those processes are going to differ depending on hearing loss. So to look at this, what I did is I collected audiograms on individuals, so standard audiogram and also the extended high-frequency audiogram, which we're finding more and more important, is actually an early indicator of hearing loss. So once you're over the age of 30, those high frequencies that don't actually get tested when you go to the audiologist are already starting to show pretty significant declines. And then I also have a test of accented speech and speech and noise that I'll tell you a little bit more about. And of course, with frequency following response to our good old friend DA. The accented speech testing that I used is from the All-Star corpus from Dr. Ann Bradlow at Northwestern. And it's this fantastic corpus where individuals from all these different backgrounds have come in, and she has them say sentences, like the hint sentences, like the family likes fish. Then she has them say sentences that are much longer and more complex from the Declaration of Human Rights and the Little Prince. And then she has them say spontaneous speech. And what she does is she has everybody say it in their native language, and then everybody who is a bilingual repeat those same sentences in English. And so what we did is we focused on all of the accented talkers who were Spanish-English bilingual and Mandarin-English bilingual. And then we also have English monolinguals in this group. We picked 2 English talkers and we played them in quiet and in +2 background noise. And then we have Spanish-English and Chinese Mandarin-English bilinguals. And we picked people who had been previously normed through the Bradlow lab to be low, mid, and high intelligibility, just based off of ratings of listeners. And we had all of them have their sentences embedded in to talk or babble or presented in quiet. And we played 160 sentences per listener. It's a bit of a grueling task, but people made it. What we found is that although our pilot data were showing that mid and high were separable, we found that performance on the mid and the high talkers was about comparable. So in all of the analyses, I'm just going to collapse them together into a high intelligibility group and then our low intelligibility group. Again, I'm playing this FFR, so it's the exact same setup as before for the auditory physiology. But what I want to add to this is that what I showed you last time is our added response, where we really focus on the fundamental frequency, which is our measure of pitch and our measure of can you do well for speech and noise. Because what we do is we play alternating polarity. So we have polarity A and polarity B, which is just the inversion of it. And we can either add those to get the response on the top, or we can subtract them, which enhances the harmonic encoding, which is over our first format frequencies. And so what I'll show you is we've got some evidence that led me to predict that our FO would be a measure of speech and noise, just like I showed you, but that encoding of the first format, so how well their brain responds to that first format, is going to be important for accented speech recognition, as well as response consistency. FO, better SYN, so better pitch, better SYN, I've already shown you that, but for response consistency and F1, this is something that we've seen with our good readers, poor readers, children with dyslexia that I talked about earlier, is that the more you struggle with reading, the lower your response consistency and also the poorer your encoding of that first format. And I'm only stopping at the first format because the others get way too high in frequency that we can't distinguish them from the noise. So I don't think there's anything special about the first format. It's just limiting process of the FFR. So these are middle-aged adults, 30 to 60 years of age, with a range of hearing acuity, and these are all monolingual English speakers. So now if I just plot their audiograms, the blue box on top would be the normal range, and that second box from 20 to 40 would indicate mild hearing loss. And so we have 19 who have normal hearing, and 25 who have very moderate hearing loss. This is very mild hearing loss, unless you look at their extended high frequencies. So now you can see that for our hearing loss group, they're just in the severe to profound range for extended high frequencies. And you can even see that our normal hearing group is still falling in the mild hearing loss for their extended high frequencies. But if we look at what's called a pure tone average, which is something audiologists will look at to determine whether or not there is a hearing loss, actually, because they only look at these lower frequencies, our hearing loss group wouldn't even qualify as having hearing loss by some audiologic standards. So we're talking about very subtle variations in hearing. So now normal hearing is in black, our hearing loss group is in red. So this is their performance on understanding native English talkers in quiet. And we can see that there's no difference. If we look at how they performed when understanding our high intelligibility accented talkers, there's no difference, and they also match with how they performed with the quiet English talkers. So high intelligibility accent just as well as native English. For the low intelligibility talkers, it's just that hearing loss group. So having subtle hearing loss makes you struggle to understand accents. Nobody would have ever thought this. Everybody would have thought, okay, accents are hard for everybody, but they're only hard when it's in noise. But we're showing that no, accents are hard and quiet for people with just a teeny bit of hearing loss. Now if we look at the noise effects, so we have native English talkers and noise. So this is exactly kind of what I've been showing you the whole time. Speech and noise is difficult for everybody. There's a decrease, but it's even more difficult for people with hearing loss. You can see that similar trend with the high intelligibility talkers, and now you can see everything really drops off for low intelligibility talkers in noise. Now when looking at the FFR, we are looking again at these measures, and you can see that there's a little bit of a decline in formant encoding and FO encoding for our hearing loss group, but it's not significant. I think part of it is we're underpowered. We're still adding more subjects to this data set. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to look separately for the hearing loss group and the normal hearing group. Can any of these measures, any of these auditory measures, predict their performance on speech and noise, and separately on accented speech recognition? And so for our hearing loss group, for accented speech recognition, we can see that there are two factors that actually predict it very well, just like I had said we would see. So that first formant encoding and also their hearing abilities. So hearing abilities, totally expected, right? But the first formant encoding, that's exactly what we would expect given what we know about language and the FFR, that having better encoding of your harmonics is going to lead to better distinguishing of phonemes. For normal hearing, we saw that, again, it was this first formant and response consistency, but for them it was that extended high-frequency hearing, the one that we currently ignore when considering hearing loss. So even in our normal hearing people, those high frequencies mattered. For a speech and noise, we saw that for our hearing loss group, our FFRFO, so our pitch encoding, and of course hearing acuity, so just like we would expect. For our normal hearing group, we didn't see any speech and noise predictors, and I really think that it's because of the fact that this speech and noise test didn't have that level of difficulty that we typically do for folks with normal hearing, because we really did want to make sure that our hearing loss folks could do this task. So in summary for this, we do see that accented speech recognition and speech and noise recognition call on totally different auditory mechanisms, and that mild, very mild hearing loss negatively affects both accented speech and speech and noise recognition. And then just to kind of put it all together, that it splits along the dimension of accents, formats, noise, pitch. Next steps are to look at the native Chinese, Mandarin, and native Spanish listeners and how they do when understanding accents that they're familiar with or unfamiliar with. I'd just like to thank my team. I especially want to thank Anoop and Chaitra, who have done the lion's share of the data collection. I want to thank my funding agencies. And I also want to send a special thank you to all of my collaborators and BrainVolt's colleagues past and present who were involved in so many parts of this research. Please visit our website, brainvolts.northwestern.edu. And if you are 30 to 60 years of age and want to participate, please, we're looking for English monolinguals, Spanish-English bilinguals, Mandarin-English bilinguals, range of hearing, 5 hours of testing, and it pays $100. And please just email at brainvolts@gmail.com if you'd like to participate. One of my colleagues back in Connecticut, she did this same exact study looking at young adults from a myriad of language backgrounds. And she found this exact same thing, that there's this enhancement of this pitch encoding that seems to just be a bilingual trait. The other thing that I will say, though, is that I think the caveat that we still need to explore is that all of our language pairs still include English. And so I think we still need to look at what happens if you are a Greek-Turkish bilingual or a Spanish-French bilingual. To establish the effects, we really did try to look at just bilinguals who are proficient in both languages. And the only data that I have of the sequential bilinguals who do have a bit more of a language imbalance, unfortunately we don't have a monolingual group to compare them to, so I don't know how they would compare with monolinguals. But it's certainly something that we would love to do. And one of the reasons why we're also extending it to middle-aged is because then you have a greater opportunity to get late learning bilinguals. And so we can see whether or not late learning bilinguals are showing some of these same effects. I don't think that the pitch is for the non-canonical phonemes. That's, I think, is just the formant encoding. And unfortunately, I don't have enough data in my bilingual participants yet to be able to confirm or deny that prediction. I really think that what we're talking about with the pitch enhancement is really specific to being able to understand speech and noise. And I think that when I'm thinking about bilinguals, their interlocutor is going to be a native of that language, and that they have that flexibility to go between those two languages. And so it's less about understanding accents and more about understanding speech. I do think that why they're failing, though, isn't because inhibitory control demands necessarily, but certainly there has to be some demands of having to juggle two languages. Yeah, there's that extra. You're going to have more words being activated if you have an ambiguous utterance, because you're going to have more matches across your two languages, so you have to filter through those. And you also don't have that same knowledge of the language as a monolingual just by virtue of the fact that you've spent less time in that language. And so you will have less familiarity with just the statistical probabilities of that language. I think that there have been some studies, but I can't think of what the results are right now, of people looking at kind of like a divided attention type tasks and how that might be different between bilinguals and monolinguals when inhibitory control is involved. People who code switch a lot are actually pretty excellent bilinguals. And it's because of the fact that they know the word that they're pulling from the other language has a certain meaning or a certain connotation that isn't present in the word that's in the current language, and so they'll code switch. And so this is another example where I think that a lot of people view switching between languages as being a negative thing, but it's actually quite a positive thing. The study needs to be done, but I would imagine that individuals who are more likely to code switch might actually have better inhibitory control. And one thing that I will say is that simultaneous signers, so translators who are signing and speaking at the same time, actually have greater structural integrity in their subcortical auditory system. So they have better gray matter tracts and thickness than monolinguals or anything like that. So being able to sign and speak at the same time can seem to lead to some of these advantages as well, maybe even more so. What is it that makes accents challenging, and does that factor that makes it challenging differ for monolinguals and bilinguals? And I don't have an answer for that, because I'm still collecting the bilingualism data right now, and I can't wait to know the answer. One of the big things is that I think that you have to remap your phonological space. And so you have to learn that this distinction, this boundary that I've had for years and years, actually is no longer the boundary that I'm listening for. That I have to be flexible in adapting and shifting my map of the sounds of my language, so that way I can accommodate what they're producing. And that's why I think that it's that first formant encoding that I showed you when I'm talking about the FFR, auditory processing, and why I think how well your brain is able to represent that first formant. I think it speaks for all of the formants. If we could measure them, I think they would all show the same thing. That your ability to have a really clear representation of the formant of speech is going to allow you to more easily and more flexibly remap your understanding of what the sounds of your language are going to differ from one another by. I would love to do a very large study of early language learners. If you're a bilingual, you're going to have this pitch enhancement. If you have dyslexia, you're going to have this poor response consistency, and you're going to have this poor formant encoding. And if you're all bilingual, you're going to have this better response consistency. So can we use this brain measure to identify in an individual if they're having a problem with language, it's because they have a language delay as opposed to a language disorder? Or can we see those two things in the same individual? Can we start to understand how to separate them? Can we suggest second language learning, in a household that is bilingual or speaks a language other than English in the home? Can we recommend that that child be raised bilingual, and even if they're dyslexic, it's going to be okay? A lot of the children with dyslexia who have participated in our studies in the past have ADHD as well, so we have looked at that, but we haven't looked at the intersection, but I'm really curious to look at it.